Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the cheap underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now here's your host, David Hinojosa.
Welcome to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, David Hinojosa, and today I'll be speaking with Chris Fussell on his latest book, One Mission: How Leaders Build a Team of Teams. Mr. Fussell is a partner at the McChrystal Group Leadership Institute and co-author of Team of Teams, the first book on the Team of Teams series. He's a former Navy SEAL. He served as aide-de-camp to Lieutenant General Stanley McChrystal during his final year commanding a joint special operations task force fighting Al-Qaeda. Mr. Fussell has also served as senior fellow for national security at New America and currently sits at the board of directors of Navy SEAL Foundation. He's also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and teaches at Yale University. Mr. Fussell, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for your service.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that.
Now, I noticed that your book, One Mission, is a continuation of Team of Teams. This is the second book on this series. And I read it, and I found it very interesting and complex. And there's a wealth of information about teamwork, team structure, and leadership.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate you taking the time with it. So we wrote Team of Teams about 2 years ago, as you said, and the goal with that book was to sort of frame for our own thinking and others sort of this big theory of the case on what's going on in the world right now that's making things so much more complex, right? And this is something we discovered inside the special operations community in the years after 2001. So we had this big traditional, very well-built sort of purpose system that was designed for a different type of conflict. And suddenly we found ourselves in an environment really in Iraq as the insurgency there started to grow exponentially, where the old playbook, the way that things had always worked, wasn't just one step behind. It was exponentially behind where it needed to be as far as speed on the battlefield. So fortunately, we had the right type of leadership in place to start to change that model. And now that's what we presented in Team of Teams. And then One Mission, based on a lot of conversations that we've had over the last few years, it intends to be a roadmap to implementation for leaders that want to leverage a similar sort of model in their organization.
I see. Yeah, I noticed that you talk about how the military had this classical approach to leadership or organization. You talk about a bureaucratic style. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's not to One Mission, neither One Mission nor the work we do at McChrystal Group intends to be an attack on bureaucracies. I mean, these models were purpose-built for, years and years, for generations. We've grown up inside of these, and there's a lot of strength to them still, even in today's environment. But they're insufficient. They need to layer in the speed and interconnectedness of these external networked problems that are making life so much more complex for us. And so what we propose in One Mission, and what worked for us in the special operations community, is the creation of a hybrid model where you don't throw the org chart out. This is still leaving in place the stability and predictability that you get from those traditional models, but integrating into that the cross-connectivity that allows an organization to also move with the speed and adaptability of a network.
Yes, I found that very interesting because you also talk about how that is a reaction, or the implementation of a hybrid model is due to a reaction on a changing environment. Could you talk a little bit about changing environment? Sure.
The reality is, for the reason that bureaucracies worked so well for so many generations is that everyone was playing the same game, whether you were an industry or nation states or armies fighting each other. Think of World War II. There were obviously massive differences in the intended end state, the ideology supporting that end state. But if you looked at the armies themselves, there were differences, but they looked very similar on paper. They were structured in a similar sort of bureaucratic model. Information flowed up and down, et cetera. So you could play as two equal actors, and whoever's system whoever's bureaucracy was more efficient, passed information more effectively, and had better leaders on the ground, ultimately was going to win. So that obviously went in our favor in that conflict. Now we entered these conflicts with that same sort of traditional structure, facing actors who had no central structure. They weren't top-down bureaucracies. They were just a bunch of individuals who were connected around an idea. And their actions on the ground would change daily. So that's a similarity that others are seeing in their markets as well. So a big traditional top-down industry, when facing a interconnected consumer base who can talk about a new product before it even hits the shelves, or who can go into a superstore and see a new product on the shelf, take a picture of it on their smartphone, get a better price online, and order it, and it'll be on their front porch before they get back from the store. Like, that's a level of change in the environment that big systems aren't designed to handle. So everyone's muscling through this together, and that's what we're trying to share in One Mission, is our approach to creating the organizational model that was really effective.
Yes, I noticed that you also mentioned how you mentioned about an aligning narrative, and that's one of the core chapters in this book that has to do with this hybrid model. Could you tell us a little bit more about the aligning narrative?
Yeah. If you walk into any big business, there's going to be, a bumper sticker on the wall that says, be the best in market, or win, whatever the case may be. And we had those in the military as well. But I would argue in today's environment, where things are changing so quickly, as we just discussed, that some big banner like that doesn't really have the impact we're hoping it would. And so our senior leadership started to create this idea of an aligning narrative. We didn't call it that at the time, but what it was really a story that they told us every day that forced us to consider how we were changing and adapting as a culture. It wasn't a mandate around do these sorts of operations or answer these sorts of metrics. Their aligning narrative that they shared with us was, we have to have a trust-based organization. We have to be an enterprise that is founded on relationships. At this point, we're 20-some-odd thousand people spread around the world, fighting in a constantly changing environment. So the narrative they started to give us was, you have really, really powerful tribal norms in all your different units, between SEAL platoons and Army Rangers and civilian intelligence folks, etc. All of those are grounded in really powerful histories, but there's no overarching mission that we all agree on. So the mission they gave us was to become a interconnected culture. Their theory was, if we can operate as an enterprise the same way we operate as a SEAL platoon, so if the Pentagon, who's this big traditional structure, can move with the speed and adaptability of a 16-person SEAL platoon, well, then that's unstoppable, because now you have power, scale, predictability, and highly agile operators on the ground moving with speed and adaptation. And it wasn't immediate, but that over time, that's what we started to feel like. And it was based on this idea that our leadership gave us a story to be part of. And our story was, we were going to change as a culture and operate as an interconnected enterprise, which was really powerful.
Now, how long did it take the leadership to come up with this aligning narrative?
It's a good question. What didn't happen was, and I was at the tactical level, so sort of the ground level, when these changes started to be put in place, and then was fortunate to spend a year with the senior leadership when I was, as you mentioned, when I was McChrystal's aide de camp. But there was the leadership didn't do an offsite and come up with the battle plan and present a 500-page culture change document, right? This was very organic, and they demonstrated a willingness, which I think was the most important part, and an important skill for other leaders to try to model, a willingness to get in front of the organization and say, I think we're losing this conflict. I think we have a problem that's moving at a pace and scaling at a level that we can't keep up with. So we have to change the way we do business. That was sort of step one. Now, how do we do that? What's working? What isn't working? If it's working, let's do more of it. Let's iterate on it. If it's not working, let's figure out why or throw it away. So that sort of small team constant adaptation that you see in a startup or a sales team, et cetera, they pulled that up to the enterprise level and iterated through it. So in probably 6 to 12 months after they first started that conversation, we started at the ground level to sense that there was something different happening. For it to become integrated into sort of the DNA of the organization was probably 12 to 18 months. But then once it picked up and people realized, wow, this is just a new and interesting way of doing business, now we're keeping up and moving faster than these really agile terrorist networks, then there was no turning back. Then people just accepted that this is the new way this organization is being run. And the narrative evolved over time inside of that.
Okay. Now, was this easy? Was it easy for the leadership, or what challenges did they face in aligning everybody to this narrative? I mean, because you have, you're talking about a cross-cultural alignment. How was there any challenges that they faced, or was it easy for people to get behind this?
No, there's always challenges in any sort of culture change, right? And we were no better than others on that front. And I think out of the gates, we probably benefited from the fact that there wasn't a defined end state. The plan was, let's change until it works, right? So you couldn't really, if you wanted to be an antagonist to the process, it wasn't like there was a plan you could point at and say, I disagree with that. The plan was, let's change to win. So that's hard to disagree with, right? Now, there were certainly little steps along the way where people started to feel threatened or lose their power base inside the organization around information control or authorities. As those started to get more decentralized, there were certainly actors that said, well, I'm not comfortable going down that road. I don't trust that team over there. I don't want to share this information. Yeah. So there were some pains in that aspect. But success breeds success, right? So when people started to see it work, at a certain point, even those that wanted to be naysayers, that what they were really arguing against was improvement. So as things started to improve, it became harder and harder for people to say, well, I disagree with it, because the old way clearly wasn't working. So in time, people got on board. It took a different amount of time depending on the types of personality where they were in the organization. But ultimately, you have to find incremental success to make anything like this really effective.
I see. Now, let's talk about the decentralization of, or let's talk about the autonomy that was given to the groups. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And that's part of how this hybrid model also became successful.
Yeah, that's right. So, part of the challenge we faced was, imagine a group of special operators in the old model going out to conduct a raid on a terrorist cell at a safe house somewhere in the outskirts of Iraq, right? So incredible operators, great equipment, a well-planned and rehearsed operation, and everything goes great, because we have so many great folks and advantages in that environment. So they fly out, they hit the target, they get new intelligence, they come back into base, and there's a mothership, so sort of headquarters, that's waiting for that team to come back to share new information. That information will get passed up. Senior leaders, intelligence folks will look at it. Then they'll decide what's going to happen next. And the next part of the plan will go down to another team who will get on their helicopters and go out and hit another target. All those targets can go really well, and they were for about a year as we were figuring out how much faster the problem was. The issue is all the successes weren't adding up to any big victory, right? So we were still watching the insurgency grow. As this interconnected and decentralized model was put into place, fast forwarding a few years, what that SEAL platoon that goes out and hits a target finds new and raw data, they could literally, as they're on their helicopters coming back to base, communicate with folks around the globe and say, look, here's what we just learned. We thought this 20 minutes ago, but we've just learned something contradictory or something that seems more important. And so we recommend we now look at the problem through this lens versus where we were before we hit this target. And another team could literally be on helicopters heading to a target, updated on what this other team discovered across the country, and deviate to a third location and say, based on that, our understanding now changes. We're going to go hit this other terrorist network over here. We didn't even know that existed 20 minutes ago. Now we're moving with this adaptability and the speed that's faster than these 2 or 3 person terrorist cells that we're chasing around the country. We synchronize as a global network and operate as a small team feel.
Now, talking about that, you mentioned also that the success of that was due to interconnectors or hubs.
That's right, yeah. So, every organization that we work with now in the McChrystal group, if you have this conversation, they say, well, yeah, we've got great actors that are kind of out there that really make things happen. There's different ways that people describe this, but this has been studied for years inside of organizational dynamics. There are networks inside of any big industry that actually make things happen, and these are individual actors. It could be, someone with low authorities in the organization, but they're connected to others, and so nothing ever really happens in sales until, Andy is part of the conversation. Nothing happens in marketing until people reach Karen's desk. And Karen might be 3 layers down and 2 layers over from the leadership, but she's hugely influential, right? And so what we started realizing as we increased the speed with which we communicated and the amounts of folks involved in those communication forums, so McChrystal established a system where we had thousands of people reconnecting in one 90-minute forum every 24 hours on a video teleconference. In that environment, these key actors inside the network started to emerge. And so you realize, wow, if I want to understand what's going on against that particular threat, here's the person I go to. And I've never heard of them before, but those networks started to emerge. And then our leadership could leverage them to their advantage. Now, in industry, there are amazing tools, some of which we leverage in the work we do, to go out and identify those networks. Those can be self-reported. You can identify them through technological means. You can start to pinpoint the actors and the teams that really drive information flow and decision and action inside any global enterprise and immediately begin to leverage them for their strengths. Those are the network side of this hybrid model. So identifying and leveraging them is critical in today's world.
Now, who appoints these interconnectors, or are these just emerging from the situations that arise?
Well, it's interesting. We actually did both, and you would recommend in any industry consider approaching it through both lenses. Some are there naturally, so you want to discover who they are, figure out strengths, how are they operating, how do we scale that. So that was very organic in our approach. You can also say, I see a gap in between my New York office and my London office, between my marketing team and my sales team. Or, in our case, we saw a gap between our military enterprise and our civilian intelligence counterparts, both fighting critical parts of the fights, but not connected enough. So we, under McChrystal's guidance, started to deploy very senior and experienced liaison officers all around the globe. So an individual actor that would be pulled out of the Special Operations Task Force and put into an intelligence organization, for example, or at a critical State Department embassy somewhere around the world. And they were a connector back into that system. They had a direct tether to our senior leadership. So they brought that organization that they were embedded inside of, they brought to bear all of the strength and information and intelligence that our task force could possibly provide to that other enterprise. So we established a give sort of foundation, and through that we were able to establish truly trust-based relationships. And the same type of thing can work in industry. If there's a problem between your New York and LA office or between marketing and sales, exchange high performers between those two. And it doesn't need to be for 6-month deployments like we would do. That can be for 2 weeks. So they really understand the perspective of that other team, and they'll bring that back, and there'll be a deeper sense of trust and understanding that can help those parts of the organization operate as a single unit.
Now, in your opinion, what are 3 characteristics that an interconnector should have, based on your experience and what you talk about in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the list could go on. I'd say they have to have the ability to establish relationships. There's lots of ways to do that, but I know in our experience, our senior leadership was very involved in hand selecting these people. There were battlefield decisions that they allowed to happen in a decentralized way, but they would hand select an individual that was going to go into, say, a critical embassy. That person had to have an established and known ability to form relationships with people outside of their comfort zone. They have to have an ability to understand strategy. So they have to be a higher level thinker. And you could almost sacrifice like battlefield acumen for the ability to contextualize it inside of strategy because of where the types of conversations you're expecting them to have when they get to that other component, because they're speaking on behalf of the senior leadership. They have to have an intellectual curiosity for what it is that other organization does. They have to show up excited to say, I really want to learn from the sales team or the marketing team. I want to understand how you see the market, and I'll bring that knowledge back to my organization. And it really helps if they're known players. So if the assuming entity is getting someone that's new and they've never heard of, it's going to take longer to establish trust there. If they're getting a known actor who has a great reputation in whatever division they're coming from, then it's quicker to be able to break down those barriers. So you add all that up, and what you're really looking for, and this is where it gets hard, is established high performers. I mean, we were asking units to give up some of their best actors to go and be away from the battlefield for an extended period. And at first, that can seem pretty daunting, but the return on that investment was literally immeasurable. What that one individual could do to pull together different enterprises was just amazing. And so once that was established, then that part of it became easier and easier.
I see. Now, you also talk about social contagion and social learning. How are these different?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's all an interconnected space, right? Of the way that information spreads around an organization. But the idea of social contagion is how do ideas spread? This happens naturally, and sort of think of Facebook, right? You put information out there, people start to pick it up, and it spreads in a very sort of organic and unpredictable network sort of fashion, right? And so So that's sort of in our human nature to learn as a collective body of people through that sort of passing of information and insights. What this system allowed was our leadership to leverage that sort of natural part of how we think and operate as humans, and to say, okay, I want to deliberately create a sort of a social network of people that are going to understand and spread this idea, which goes back to the earlier point of identifying key network actors. Here's what we need to understand. Here are the folks that sit at the center of that sort of social contagion, so I need to make sure that they understand and they can influence, educate, build out the team and the different components of our organization. So these things happen naturally. The question is, how can organizations leverage that to their advantage?
Yeah, I found that very, very interesting. The difference between both of them and how they do help interconnect. Now, I'd like to talk about decision space. What does that mean?
Yeah, so decentralizing decisions creates a sense of sort of uncertainty and risk with senior leaders in an organization. What a system like this does is it allows you to move with the speed, but control for the risk that comes with networked, decentralized sorts of models. One way of controlling the risk is you can control the periodicity with which you reconnect. So, as I said before, we lived on this 24-hour cycle. That was one way of our senior leadership saying, you can run this fast for this long, but every 24 hours we're going to resynchronize ourselves, right? So that's one control for risk. The other was this decision space. So if you're a very seasoned player in the system and I'm a brand new actor, I shouldn't be able to make as many decisions as you can. I shouldn't have all the authorities for autonomy that you have. I can have maybe 2 or 3 things that I'm allowed to do independently, but I'm constrained by 12, 13, 20 things that I need to check in before I can execute. You've been on the sales team for 8 years, and you understand our market really well. The senior leadership knows and trusts you. you can do 19 things with independence between those windows of resynchronization, and there are 2 or 3 things that they want you to check in, and those are very strategic level things, right? So I can, and given the transparency of the communication models that were put in place in the task force, if I'm a new operator leading a SEAL element, I can look across those boundaries every day and see you as maybe a peer on paper, but a much more experienced Ranger element leader who has all these authorities under your purview. And I watch how you connect those up to strategy on a daily basis. So I'm learning from you. It's breaking down my tribal barriers because I realize your unit is great and you're a great leader. And you're incentivized to reach across boundaries and educate me as a junior person to become as good as you. You want me to understand how this system works because you want me to have as many authorities as you do, because every time I have to ask for permission, I'm slowing our senior leadership down. So it becomes a coaching and mentoring tool across boundaries, as well as a way to control for the risk of decentralization.
So decision space is depends on experience, right? That's the underlying message behind the decision space.
It does, and that happens in any big enterprise. I mean, a senior member of any organization can say, "Well, yeah, I let this person do this, and I let this person do a little less, and this person a little more." That's natural as you groom leaders up. What often doesn't happen, though, in a traditional bureaucracy is those 3 actors, they don't see why and where one person can do more than another. So our human nature and our uncertainty and our paranoia, and we've all been there, you assume, well, Karen can do more because the boss likes her, or because, she closed that last deal and so they think she's great. What the transparency of our communication model allowed, when all of us would resynchronize every 24 hours, it broke down those barriers, and I started to realize, oh, wow, Karen can do all those things because she's better. She understands what we're doing at a much higher level than I do. She has a lot more experience, and she can tie action to strategy. I want to learn from her. I'm no longer intimidated by her. I see her as a peer, and she sees me as a new actor that can get to her level. So these relationships start to be created across these boundaries, leveraging what's often there in any system, but coupling it with transparency so it really becomes an education piece as well.
I see. Now, you also talk about positive deviants. What are they? I thought that was a very interesting concept when I read about it.
So, positive deviants, we didn't invent that term. It's been around for a while inside of anthropology and other academic spaces. And what a positive deviant is, in simplest terms, is it's an actor inside of a system who understands the rules and regulations. So they're not a huge risk to the organization. They're not going to go out and break the law, but so they're positive influencers. But they're deviant in as much as, okay, you're saying we want this. Let me noodle with that a little bit. Let me experiment within the boundaries that you've given me, and I'll constantly come back and challenge you and say, well, you allowed me to do this one thing, but if I could do this other thing, or I could do that one thing just a little bit differently, I think we'd be better for it.
So they're constantly pushing the envelope, right?
Constantly pushing the envelope, but not in a way that creates constant risk. Right? And so many great steps in organizations have been driven by positive deviance. The difficulty that positive deviants have is that, especially in today's world, is that the system often moves too slow for them because they get frustrated quickly because they want to see this change. They know what right looks like, and they're willing to take some personal risk to get there. And if the system can't keep up with them, they become flight risks. They're going to start their own thing. They're going to move on to another enterprise. Well, the transparency that was put in place inside of this sort of model allowed those positive deviants to have their stage every 24 hours. They could create cross-boundary relationships. They could speak directly to senior leadership. They were the ones that were constantly sitting on the edge of that authority and saying, all the stuff we're doing is great. Here's one more thing I need. If I could do this, we could get this much further. So new actors could look at it and say, wow, that's who I want to become. They're the ones really driving change in the organization. And then the positive deviants are much more comfortable. They're less of a flight risk because they feel like they're being heard and that their insights are being acted upon.
I see. Well, that was extremely interesting. I really enjoyed reading about the concept and how it fits within the hybrid model that you talk about. Unfortunately, Mr. Fussell, that is all the time we have today. This was very interesting, and I wish you the best of luck with this book.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Great discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fussell. I've been talking with Mr. Chris Fussell on this book, One Mission, How Leaders Build a Team of Teams. A very interesting book on teamwork and leadership. I highly recommend it. I'm your host, David Hinojosa, and I want to remind you that if you didn't hear a regularly scheduled broadcast on our NPR affiliate, you can listen to this interview on our YouTube page, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thank you for listening.